Let's read a little bit of Philippians 2. So we find Paul here once again, and I say once again because he has to do it repeatedly in his letters. Paul has to appeal to the churches, to his fellow Christians, to be Christ like. Keep renewing their minds, he says to the church at Ephesus. This is a repeated appeal and commandment from the Apostle Paul. And in this instance, he tells the church here at Philippi to set their eyes on this man, the historical Jesus. So, verse 5 is important in establishing who Paul is talking about. Paul is not speaking about some pre existent being that took on flesh, some second person of a Trinity. That is someone you cannot relate to. I cannot relate to that being, thing. We have to relate to one of our fellow human beings. So I love that, right? In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset or attitude as the Messiah, Jesus. While on earth, we're talking about the historical Jesus. While he was on earth, he was in the form of God. What does that mean? Well, it means to me that this Jesus sounded and acted like his God and Father. Why? Because he was the unique agent, and more than that, he was his own son. So can you imagine? People tell me, and as I get older, it looks like I become more like my father. In other words, I look more like my father, and people always comment about that. So you can picture the meaning Paul is trying to convey here, that while he was on earth, he looked like his God and Father. Although it's interesting that no one has ever really seen fully God. But Jesus did say, remember in John 14, they're appealing to Jesus. Jesus, when are you going to show us the Father? He's surprised. He says, how long have I been with you guys? If you see me, you see the Father. Mm-hmm. So I think that's applicable to in the form of God. And then Paul says, yet, contrast, he did not consider that he was basically God himself, equal to God. And he didn't take that position, that form, that he sounded and acted like God as something, he says, for his own advantage. And you can also read here parallels with the first Adam. Mm-hmm. He did take advantage. He did fail. And then in verse 7, rather, Paul says, he constantly emptied himself by taking another form, the form of a slave. So throughout this passage, we can also hear echoes of the so-called suffering servant passages from the book of Isaiah, chapter 52. And you will see here some interesting parallels, and you can sort of read Paul's mind as he wrote this, that he has all these Old Testament figures and prophecies about this Jesus in mind, verses 13 and 14. So you can hear form, appearance. He's a human person. He's a human being, and he becomes that servant figure for us to show us, Paul says, to go back to Philippians 2, that you guys are to serve each other. Not only serve each other, but perhaps at times die for each other, suffer for each other. And it's interesting here, Paul says that he goes on to say the Messiah humbled himself in Philippians 2, verse 8. And there's an interesting parallel if you go to 53, verse 8. So that's the Jesus Paul is pointing to for us here. That's the man we're trying to emulate here. So again, Isaiah 53, verse 8, the servant of the Lord in his humiliation, some versions have, justice was denied. So when Paul says the Messiah poured out himself, what does that exactly mean? He says he emptied himself by becoming obedient unto death. The servant poured out his soul, in other words, himself. He gave himself, all of himself, and died for us. That's the great lesson. There's an interesting commentary from the Theological Dictionary New Testament. They note that the Greek phrase translated emptied himself in Philippians 2:7 is an expression not attested elsewhere in the Greek. And it's an exact translation from the Hebrew in Isaiah 53, verse 12. His soul he poured out. So it's a direct link that Paul is wanting us to make with this suffering servant. And Paul adds that the Messiah was humble because unlike the first Adam, Paul says this one obeyed God and even died on a cross.